So, when the Great Depression hit the United States, it worried a lot of bankers, and they immediately acted on that. They started demanding repayment for their overseas loans, as well as withdrawing all the money they held in European accounts. And this was devastating to the countries that relied on loans from the United States. In addition to that, in an effort to try and keep the dollar within the United States, the government set extremely high tariffs. For example, the Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed, and it set the prices for foreign imported goods higher than they've ever been in the United States. And this was devastating to the countries whose economies relied on exporting goods to the United States. It also set off a chain reaction. Other countries immediately followed suit and set their own really high tariffs, and this in turn destroyed global trade. It fell by 65% and sent unemployment rates like sky high. A lot of countries dealt with the Great Depression really well, others didn't as much. For example, Germany and Austria were hit really hard by the Great Depression because they were already in expansive debt from World War I, and Austria was one of the countries that relied a lot on loans from the United States. So once the U.S. took all their money out of Europe, it sort of immediately crashed the economies in Germany and Austria. In fact, the largest and oldest bank in Austria at the time went bankrupt. It collapsed. Mom, what was it called?
Kreditanstalt.
And it was eventually rescued by an employee named Otto Ender, but it caused sort of a financial panic throughout the neighboring countries in Central Europe. Out of all the Asian countries, Japan was probably hit the hardest by the Great Depression, as well as already having to deal with the economic crisis. Japan in 1931 faced these horrible widespread crop failures. None of the rice would grow, so people in Japan had nothing to sell and nothing to eat. It led to widespread horrible famine. Japanese families ended up eating tree bark and like the roots of wildflowers. So they'd go get all these weird plants and just chew on the roots. That's all they could do. The Great Depression also affected Japan socially, in the sense that since unemployment rates were so high, 3 million people lost their work in the cities. So there was this widespread de-urbanization. People were moving back to the rural villages that they came from. Latin American countries were tied to the global economy because they were producers of sugar, beef, copper, and tin. And in the 1920s, the demand for these Latin American products was already declining. So during the Great Depression, when all the countries set up these really high tariffs, there was absolutely no demand, no market for these products. And because of supply and demand, since the demand for these goods were so low, the Latin American countries would lower the prices to try and sweeten the deal and make people more inclined to purchase their goods, but it wasn't working. It didn't sweeten the deal enough, and prices kept falling. And while this was happening, people also weren't really producing as much anymore, because think about it, if you're a farmer in a Latin American country, you're not going to spend the little money that you do have to grow these crops and to mine this copper and tin if no one's going to buy it anyway. So now Latin American countries had their own tariffs as well. So the amount of money they have to spend is withering away, and they can't buy goods from other producers in their own countries because they're not producing as much. So their only option is to purchase these foreign goods, which are so incredibly expensive because of the tariffs. So they have very little money and they can't afford anything anymore. So the standard of living fell a lot in Latin American countries. A lot of countries in Latin America weren't as advanced as Western countries like the U.S., so they borrowed a lot to sort of grow and develop their nations. They borrowed a lot of money, and now with the Great Depression, they couldn't really pay it back at all, and they were in extensive debt. A lot of countries handled the Great Depression very well. Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, as well as France and Great Britain, all made slow, steady recoveries. They didn't bounce back right away at all from the Great Depression, but they still recovered successfully. Britain, for example, was hit very hard by the Great Depression because they were so intertwined with the global economy. They relied a lot on foreign trade. British investors were very involved with the stock market. So when the Great Depression hit, unemployment rates were rising as high as 70% in some areas. Almost every single family relied on the dole, which was unemployment insurance paid by local governments at the time. Voters elected a multi-party coalition to sort of try and ease the financial crisis that was going on in Britain at the time. A coalition is sort of the best way to do this because that way you can get economists from all the different political backgrounds together to collaborate and figure out the best possible solution to help Britain's economy. They formed the national government, which was led by Ramsay MacDonald, right here. So the national government set really high tariffs as well, high taxes. They tried their best to regulate the currency, and they lowered interest rates to try and encourage more industrial growth. And slowly and steadily, Britain's economy recovered from the Great Depression. France wasn't affected quite as much as Britain because their economy was very agricultural. France wasn't really involved with the global economy that much. There wasn't a lot of interest in France in the stock market, and there wasn't any big corporations. It was mostly small local businesses, and this sort of cushioned the French people from the Great Depression, but it didn't cushion them entirely. There was still really high unemployment rates, and they were still faced with economic crisis. In 1933, there was actually 5 coalition governments that came to be and then collapsed again. So the economic crisis led to political instability in a lot of ways until the moderate socialists and communists formed the Popular Front, which was led by Leon Blum, who I have a picture of right here. Hold on. This is an artistic rendering of him, which is really nice. So they started the Popular Front. Same idea as with Britain. It's coalitions is basically when it's teamwork really, when different political parties come together to fix a crisis and handle situations the best way they can. So what the Popular Front did to help the economy, they increased pay, so they increased everyone's wages. They made holidays paid, so when you took a vacation from work, you wouldn't just not be paid anymore. And they also introduced a 40-hour work week. And Leon Blum is actually interesting when you think about him, because in 1933, there was so Leon Blum had influence over this one political group called the SFIO. This is their logo. It's a socialist group in France. Blum was a socialist. And in 1933, there were these neo-socialists in the SFIO that were sort of gaining political speed, and they wanted to have another Marxist revolution, sort of like Lenin. And as we know, that's bad news. So in 1933, thankfully, Leon Blum had influence in that organization because he kicked them out, and that's important. Otherwise, we could have had a whole nother communist revolution in France. And the next year, 1934, with Hitler sort of starting to gain power in Germany, there were a lot of Hitler-inspired fascist riots in Paris. On February 6, 1934, there was actually an attempt at a fascist coup d'etat in Paris. France was this close to being overthrown by the fascist government, and Leon Blum and the Popular Front sort of squashed that effort. And then in 1936, there was an election to see who would be in power in France, and it was the Popular Front up against the French communists. And thankfully, Leon Blum and the Popular Front won that election. Otherwise, we may have had like a French version of Hitler and Mussolini. So it's funny. France just got lucky with Leon Blum in a way, because so many times they attempted to assassinate him. Like moderates were like, "Oh, a socialist in power," and tried to kill him. Anti-Semites were like, "Oh, a Jew in power," and tried to kill him. But thankfully, they didn't, and thankfully, France didn't fall into a fascist, totalitarian dictatorship. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden in Scandinavia also met the crisis successfully because those nations have a long tradition of community and cooperation, so everyone helped each other out. They also handled it like the best way they could. Sweden had a lot of big public works projects, kind of like the United States did, and this sort of helped with the unemployment issue because it gave a lot of people jobs. They also raised pensions for the elderly, they taxed all the citizens, they increased unemployment insurance, they improved other welfare programs, and businesses actually prospered. And it's important to remember that all these nations, the Scandinavian nations, France and Britain, they all maintained democracy, which was very important because, as we know, other countries like Germany and Italy did not. Instead of forming coalitions and figuring out the best way to solve the economy together, Germany and Italy sort of just entrusted Hitler and Mussolini, which it didn't work out well for them, which Charlie Team tomorrow will probably be talking more about. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, commonly called FDR, was the president during the Great Depression in America. He was elected in 1933, and he was the 32nd president of our country. He launched a program called the New Deal, which started a bunch of public works projects to sort of decrease unemployment, and it provided a lot of people with jobs and opportunities, which was important in rejuvenating the American economy. The government at this time also provided a lot of aid for businesses and farms. They improved welfare and relief programs. There were a bunch of smaller organizations set up by the New Deal, for example, the AAA, the CCC, NIRA. The reading in our SawTech packet talks more about that. He was elected because Franklin Roosevelt was very confident that he could help the American people, and this was comforting to Americans because the times were so trying back then. An example of his confidence and comforting nature, this is a quote from his first inaugural address. "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." So he was very well spoken and helped the country a lot. And when I was reading about the New Deal, it didn't really make that much sense to me. The whole issue with the Great Depression is that no one has money. So where is the government getting money to A, like, get the raw materials needed for all these big projects, and B, to pay people for it? And what I was like, I had no idea. I was so confused. But what the government did was they issued bonds, and which were picked up by investors. Like the few corporations that still did have money would lend money to the government. Even when there are trying times, the government can almost always find a way to borrow money. And they also printed more money, which led to a lot of inflation right after the Great Depression ended. It sort of went on the opposite end of the spectrum for a little bit. But yeah. And since you're all such good listeners, I'm going to have my dad come in as a guest presenter with a brief juggling interlude before Harry wraps up with the conclusion. That's so dumb. So
Okay.
dumb.
Cut.
Okay, bye.
And cut.